Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is Marriott Peters with AIIAT. We're thrilled that you're joining us, and we'll learn a little bit more today about one of the studies that IIT is working on. As we get people on the call and people are logging on, I'm just going to add a few comments here. First of all, we're going to have, if you have questions along the way, please chat them in your chat box, and then Matt Smith will moderate those questions throughout the event. So if there's specific questions you have, either wait till later or type it in, and at the right time he'll pause and take a break with Steve and make sure that we ask those questions. So please feel free to do that. Part of this this study that we're doing right now was launched, as many of you might know, at Joe Vincent, and Steve McKee, who's our speaker today and is also conducting the survey and the study, will be with us again at InsureCon June 10th, 11th, and 12th to present the results of this. And then, of course, we'll be making reports available to you as well. So it takes a very few minutes. It's not a long one to do, but it's part of our strategic plan at IIT to better understand our insurance community and understand what challenges folks have. As many of you know, we're working on a compensation study right now as well. So that's another data point that we're trying to gather from folks. And this one is specifically to what's the health of our industry and our agencies, and where are you in your disruptive cycle. So I'd like to welcome Steve McKee to the call. Steve, I would consider a friend. I've known him for years and years. He's got some great books out there. He's writing a book right now, which hopefully this will include some of the research that he's doing. And we'll enjoy the next 45 minutes or so hearing about the disruption cycle. And then I hope you'll take an action at the end and make sure that you do the study with us, go answer the questions, and provide us the data we have so we can bring better programming to you throughout the year. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Marriott, very much. And hello, everybody. Happy day after President's Day. Hope your Tuesday's getting off to a good start. I want to spend the next 30 minutes or so probably giving you some background to the disruption cycle and explaining to you the genesis, the origin, the importance of understanding where we are as an industry in it. And probably no better place to begin than with a quote from Sir George Buckley, who was the former CEO of 3M, who said the core of every business is dying. And of course, it's not a great way to start your day. But when I first saw this quote, my first reaction was that can't be true. That's not true. But if you think about it, you can't really name too many 200 and 300-year-old companies. There are a handful around. I think we traced one down to Japan that's like 1,200 years old or something. But very few companies make it past a handful of generations, even big publicly traded companies. And that's because the world continually changes around us. And it's kind of funny because when it changes more slowly than we change, so when a company's lifetime is longer than a human's lifetime, we tend not to notice it as much as when a company's lifetime is shorter than a human's lifetime, which tends to be an infrequent occurrence. But it happens all the time. And I offer you a quick quiz by way of setting that up. If you go back to the year 2003 and try to think in your own mind about this company that I have here described on the deck, 7,000 stores and $5 billion in revenue. And at the Joe Vincent seminar, we asked the audience, what company is it? And it's very rare that anybody actually guesses this company correctly. People think it's Sears or maybe J.C. Penney or Kmart, but it's a shame that often we forget what this company really is, when in fact this company used to be on every street corner. In fact, there was a time at its peak when Radio Shack had a store within 5 miles of every American. And if you remember, if you're old enough to remember, Radio Shack's appeal was, they carried some esoteric products. If you needed some speaker wire or you needed a weird battery, for some device or some electronic tool of some kind, you go to Radio Shack and you could pick it up. What happened to Radio Shack? Well, we know what happened to Radio Shack. This is what happened to Radio Shack. A lot of things happened to it, but by and large, if you need that speaker wire, which you don't need anymore, or if you need a battery, or if you need some esoteric electronic device, and you can wait till tomorrow, you just order it from Amazon. In some cities, of course, if you can wait till this afternoon, you can order it from Amazon. And that was just one blow too much. Instead of being within 5 miles of every American, Amazon could bring everything, straight to your door. And it just is reflective of the fact that the world has changed. Amazon also put the final blows into Toys R Us. Company had its own issues, had a management buyout, private equity firms. There was some internal disagreement. But when it came down to it, when it came to the holiday shopping season, Amazon was just too darn convenient. And sure enough, Toys R Us shut its doors. Whole Foods even, which is an exciting young company, relative to the rest of these, saw what was coming and saw what was happening and decided to sell itself, in this case, to Amazon. I'm not picking on Amazon here. It's just that it is the world's biggest retail online operation, fighting with Walmart, for that supremacy. But so Whole Foods basically threw in the towel and said, we're not going to lick them, so we're going to join them. And it's true of a lot of different companies in a lot of different industries. What you see on your screen now is a very famous Fortune 50 company that has been around for 100 years and recently went through 5 years of quarterly sales declines. You can see all those red numbers there. Then they had 3 quarters where they made something, and then 3 quarters where it went backwards again. And they've just barely turned the corner again, and they just released their results in this most recent quarter. We'll see if it lasts. The company, might surprise you to know, is IBM. And when you think about strong, sturdy, long-lasting, forever kinds of companies, IBM certainly falls into that category. But for a variety of reasons, Amazon for a different reason, and Google with the cloud computing platform, IBM was kind of caught flat-footed. And so the company had its issues. Now, a lesser company would have died, as Sir George says. Most organizations could not survive 5 years of consecutive sales declines. IBM is a rare case, and it could. And the reason why it could is because IBM had built up a lot of credibility in the marketplace. This is a chart that shows the top 50 most valuable brands in the world, according to a company called Interbrand. And they do all kinds of analysis, and they value how much a company's brand is worth to it, separate from its plant and equipment and everything else. And as you can see, this company valued Apple as the most valuable brand in the world, $184 billion, Google number 2, Microsoft number 3, and so forth. If you go to the right of the top column, you'll see IBM, the 10th most valuable brand in the world, and it has in fact lost significant brand value over the last few years. Well, that's reflective of the revenue declines and vice versa. But since IBM had been building its brand for so long, it had tremendous reputation, if you will, among investment analysts. They believed that the company could turn itself around. Among its customer base, they knew that IBM was strong and they were going to give it a chance. Among its staff and employees, and just in the marketplace at large, because IBM had invested so much in building its reputation over such a long period of time, it effectively bought itself some time to struggle. And that's this is sort of a preamble to the disruption cycle conversation, is that your brand, or if that word feels too corporate-y or funny for you, your reputation as a company, as an organization, is unlike any other asset you own, because every other asset you own will depreciate over time. If you own your own building, the roof's going to leak, your cars are going to break down, valuable employees are going to leave. If you have any intellectual property, it'll expire. Really, every kind of asset you own deteriorates over time, but a brand, a reputation, can continually appreciate. Not that they always do, but it can. And that makes it fundamentally different and something we want to really pay attention to. The world of finance is actually catching up to this. The Economist, which is no fly-by-night organization, says that brands account for more than 30% of the stock market value of publicly traded companies in the S&P 500. And if you just pause and ponder that for a minute, you think 30% of their market capitalization is due to their reputation. It's pretty incredible. 3/5 of CEOs say that it represents more than 40% of their market cap. So they're even more bullish on the value of their brand or their corporate reputation. And of course, today we know that not only customers but staff really pay attention to what a company is and does in the marketplace. It's not enough anymore to have fairly priced good products and services, but who you are, how you think about the world really matters. And so there's a fundamental principle that we believe in, that the brand and the business are inextricably intertwined. Your brand is not, your logo. It's not your color scheme. Those are representations or manifestations of your brand. But a brand is really everything about your business. There isn't anything that isn't part of your brand, whether it's your people or your policies or your pricing or the hours you operate or the location you work. All of that stuff adds up to the brand. And initially, the business defines the value of the brand. Simple example: if you were to open a restaurant and you served really great food with friendly service, people would come try your restaurant, and that would be the business, and then they would leave and they would recommend it to other people. So you do a good job and you're going to earn a good reputation. That's the business defining the value of the brand. But as companies mature, they realize that the brand can also drive the value of the business. That is, what we are, what we champion, what we represent, how we communicate ourselves can actually make us more valuable than we would be without that. And that's why the Apple brand is worth $184 billion, Coca-Cola 79, and so forth. And so one thing I really want to underscore is, as sort of the wrap up to this preamble, is this thought. It might not seem radical, but it kind of is, that your business does not have a brand. Your brand has a business. And that'll become increasingly apparent as we go through this presentation. The idea here is we tend to think of our brands or our businesses as the thing, and they're labeled or identified as something, and that's our brand. When in reality, what we're offering to the world is a suite of benefits, physical and emotional, and how we offer them can change over time. So that is, your brand has a business. So let's get more into that, and I think it'll make sense as we go through this. One of the mentors of mine in the world of strategy, Richard Rummelt from UCLA, had this quote, which I think is really it doesn't exactly fall off the tongue, but he says the most important element of a strategy is a coherent viewpoint about the forces at work, not a plan. And it's a little bit of a stunning quote because we all do plans for a living. We do business plans, we do marketing plans, we do staffing plans, we do financial plans. And Rummelt's point is, if your viewpoint about the forces at work aren't coherent, or even if they're off by a few degrees, your plan actually could not work, or actually even do more harm than good. So the most important element of figuring out the future is understanding what's going on. And that leads us to this concept of the disruption cycle. This is based on 15 years of research that my company has done among thousands of C-suite executives. In its current iteration, it's a 53 questions survey that we're going to ask you to take. It is a proprietary methodology, but it's built around this concept of the business cycle. Now, we didn't invent the business cycle. We relabeled it here, where you can see we have disruption, something new enters the marketplace. There's an acceleration phase, a maturation phase, a saturation phase, and a commoditization phase in any kind of business. And so just to give you an example, in the restaurant category, you'd probably say that fast foods are commoditized. You can kind of get a burger anywhere, and it's a race to the bottom in terms of pricing, and they're on every corner. And so it really is a commoditized industry. It wouldn't be a fun industry to be in. In the saturation category, maybe coffee shops fit there, that there's Starbucks on every fourth corner, and so on all the other three corners, local shops have opened up. So it's kind of hard not to throw a rock and hit a coffee shop, and they're going to start running into real issues in that industry. In the maturation category, you might put fast casual, Mexican, Asian pizza, you name it, Indian. This is like Chipotle and those kind of concepts that are a little bit better than fast food for you, but still pretty fast, and they're kind of everywhere, really rapidly maturing. And then in the acceleration phase, it seems like you can't go anywhere now without a new taco concept sort of popping up, whether it's a food truck or a fancy restaurant. That might be something that you would consider an acceleration. And so this is sort of a picture of how industries, rotate through the years. To give it a micro sense of what it is, if you take like an Apple, this is kind of a fascinating case study where you have Jobs and Wozniak in the garage. This is 45 years ago, inventing the computer, basically. And then they went to market with it. And in a very short period of time, the initial desktop computer market got saturated. It didn't take very long till there was a computer on every desk, whether it was a Macintosh or a PC. And Apple lived this. They rode the wave up. then they went public, and then they rode the wave down. So Apple went through an entire cycle within about 15 years. In fact, it cost Steve Jobs his job. And what Apple did shortly after they went public was they brought in the guy who's good at managing commoditized businesses, John Sculley from PepsiCo, of all places. Well, we all know the history. He really couldn't save the company, and Apple was about to go bankrupt. So they bought Steve Jobs' company next, brought him back, and he began a new cycle of disruption and acceleration and maturation with the iMac and the iPod and the iPhone. And here we are again. Unfortunately, Steve Jobs passes away, but the iPhone, or the smartphone, is a saturated industry now. It may not seem that way because the new ones still command $1,000, but they're having a harder time selling them, and sales volume is in decline because everybody has a smartphone. And so here you have a company that's gone 45 years and lived through two complete revolutions of the disruption cycle. And much to Apple's credit, they have reinvented the company again as a services company, and the early initial results are good, that their services revenue has reached an all-time high. Now, whether this is the right strategy or not, I don't know, but it really underscores the fact that in the tech industry, which is an industry you may not want to be in, this thing turns fast, and Apple's already on its third cycle in less than a human lifetime. And so as I explained, really what the disruption cycle looks like is it's taking the adoption curve, if you will, from innovators through early adopters, early majority, late majority, and laggards, and overlaying it with what happens to the company as the marketplace develops in that way. And if you look at an economy-wide level, this was a year ago we did this research. This is what the U.S. economy looks like, with about 70% of the economy in acceleration or maturation mode. And we're in a healthy economy, so that makes sense. 70% of companies are doing pretty darn good. 15 or 30, about 30% on the right side of the Ferris wheel there, saturation commoditization mode, which is not a great place to be. And so it really is kind of like a Ferris wheel, except unless you hang on and can redisrupt your industry, most companies fall off and plop there out of the commoditization mode. And so that's what we really want to avoid. So about 70-30 in the U.S. economy at large. We did a study this year of the real estate industry, more problematic. So there it's about 40 to 45, 55, where if you think about your average real estate broker, not terribly new. The concept is not terribly new. And so it does get harder to tell them apart, one real estate agent or broker from another. And those are telltale signs of an industry that's tipping, if you will. And so they have some real issues. We also did the study in the funeral industry. Even worse, if you think about how funerals have been done for the last 100 years, really hasn't changed much. And in comes this concept of cremation, which has lowered the revenue and caught on like wildfire, and it's causing real problems. So 65% of the funeral home industry, closely held small businesses, they tend to be local, wonderful people, multi-generation firms, it's in a world of hurt because if it doesn't recognize what's happening and find a way to redisrupt itself, then more and more of those second and third generation companies are going to not make it to the third or fourth generation. So it might be helpful to look a little bit at the phases of the cycle. And one of the things that our research has done is allowed us to elaborate on what actually goes on during each phase. And it's really a pretty fascinating situation and proposition. So if you think about the acceleration phase, startups certainly fall into this category, but not only startups, companies that are just really growing rapidly because they've got a new product or service or offering of some kind. You can see the kind of statements they tend to really agree with on the right there, that we're growing aggressively and we're funding ourselves. We have clearly defined objectives. Of course, we're struggling to keep up with demand because demand is high, which is great. Same thing with staffing. Good at employee retention because, it's great. Employees are in sync with leadership here. This is a good place to be. We're fully aligned on strategy. Not all companies are making money in this phase, particularly startups, but they're going to. And these are the good old days, while you're living them. And if you ask a company in the acceleration phase, what's their biggest business challenge, they're going to say things like technology and innovation and change and, of course, hiring people and retaining people and competition. They're really focused on the marketplace and how exciting it is in there. Sooner or later, an industry moves into a maturation phase. Again, in the tech industry, it could be in 5 years. In the funeral industry, it could be in 45 years or anywhere in between. In the maturation phase, you're expanding into new markets. Your growth is outpacing your ability to maintain quality. That very often happens. Embarking on uncharted territory, maybe expanding into new service lines, maybe expanding into new geographies. We're outgrowing our internal systems. This is where you typically hire a CFO or an enterprise resource software platform. You look at those kind of things because you're trying to grow up as an organization. But you're healthy. Your customers know what you stand for. Differentiation is growing. You're achieving your objectives. You're making money at this point. And if you have to ask companies in the maturation phase their biggest business challenge, well, change, training, growth, staffing. Again, good problems to have. Competition. Interestingly enough, regulation pops up its ugly head here because, well, for two reasons. One, in a maturing industry, the government discovers it, says, oh, something to regulate. But also, sometimes maturing companies like regulations, sort of a moat to try and keep out, whether it's licensing or any number of things, to keep out other competitors. But still, good times, acceleration, maturation. This side of the circle could last for 5 years, or it could last for 75 years. Sooner or later, however, every industry, every company enters what we call a saturation phase. And this is almost by definition, because if you're making money, if you're offering something good to the world that the world is willing to pay for, you're going to attract competitors. And you're going to attract competitors until that value proposition gets diluted. So in the saturation modes, our growth is slowing. Sometimes they say our company is lost. We tend to overthink things. We're more opportunistic than strategic. And what's really sad, of course, a clear marker of saturation is the biggest business challenge, pricing. Pricing becomes a challenge because that becomes the way you differentiate, because people are comparing apples to apples. But look at the other issues: leadership, nepotism, a lot of closely held family businesses, and that can become a problem if you're looking at succession, for example. The internet demands resources. Morale is a problem in a saturating company. And if left unaddressed, sooner or later, that saturation ultimately turns into commoditization, where we're just trying to survive, and where work can now start harming your personal relationships because you take it home with you. It's more about revenue than profit. It's time our company grew up. Workarounds are the only way to get things done around here. Margins are tighter than they were a year ago, of course. We're constantly battling price pressure. We're bidding low. We need a new business model. That's a sense of a need to disrupt. We don't invest enough in training, of course, because you're trying to save money. Office politics can get in the way because there's all kinds of division at work. There's a lot of gossip at work. The marketplace has changed. We don't know our place in it. This is a really bad place to be. Some of you may have been there. Some of you may be there. I've been there in the past, and it's a very unpleasant thing. And the biggest business challenge in a commoditized company: leadership, retention, miscommunication, competence. I mean, not fun stuff to deal with. It's just very unpleasant. And I want to dive into that a little bit more, because there is more to this, and it goes back to our original research that began 15 years ago that resulted in my first book, When Growth Stalls, and my business partner's book, Brand versus Wild. What we found was, in studying companies, that there are 4 internal dynamics that tend to correlate highly with struggling companies. And you can see them here: lack of alignment, loss of focus, loss of nerve, inconsistency. But a better picture of it is probably here, because this really explains it. That when companies are struggling, for whatever reason, maybe there's a recession, maybe there's more competition, maybe there's a new technology that you don't own, any number of things, it tends to create questions internally. That lack of alignment or lack of consensus, as it says on here, where people start saying, I'm not sure we should go the way we've always gone. I think we should do that. And you have these internal arguments that are easy to overlook when everybody's making their bonus. Loss of focus is also manifests itself at this stage, where companies either stall because they got cocky by losing their focus and getting into business lines they shouldn't, or we're hit with a recession or commoditization, and so they start chasing business they shouldn't, whether that's from a price standpoint or a product standpoint or what have you. But you start to lose your way. Loss of nerve correlates with both of these things, that you get afraid. Sometimes it manifests itself by cutting your marketing spend, cutting your training spend, those sorts of things. But it can also manifest itself by sort of wanting to stand under the same tree as your competitors because you don't want to do anything bold and different. And then inconsistency is a bugaboo here as companies sort of look for silver bullet solutions. Let's try this or let's try that. And as is indicated on this chart, you can see that it's a cycle, that the lack of consensus fuels a loss of focus, which feeds the loss of nerve, which fuels inconsistency. And it doesn't really matter where in the cycle you start. It's really difficult to get out of it. The flip side, of course, is the positive side, is when you're fully aligned on the mission and vision and goals, and you have focus in the marketplace, and you go to market aggressively with conviction, and you do that consistently. That's where health is. But it's really difficult to stay on the right side, and very easy because it's quite natural to sort of slough down to the left. And that's why a lot of companies, end up not making it. Well, with that as background, for about 10 years, we have been using in various client engagements and on our website what we call a 60-second self-diagnosis, which took 20 questions from our original study, the 20 most salient questions to these 4 dynamics. And you answer the 20 questions, and up pops a little thermometer that says, what you might be dealing with. Now, the research that we did was statistically reliable and scientific and all of that. This particular survey is not, because it's 20 questions, and the thermometer isn't for sure. But what it is, it's a discussion point with companies to say, yeah, you might be struggling with a lack of consensus and inconsistency, but your loss of focus and loss of nerve is okay at this point. What's so fascinating about this is we rolled these questions into our new wave of research, and the correlation with the stages of the cycle is pretty fascinating. That is, when a company is in acceleration mode, all systems are green. Now, it's not perfect. That's why they're not all the way to the right, because no company's perfect. But generally speaking, we're aligned, we're focused, we're brave, and we're consistent. It's a good thing. And the same thing holds true in the maturation phase. All systems are green. Again, they're not perfect, but things are going pretty well. We're making our money, we're making our bonuses, we're feeling good about the organization. They're really working. But look what happens when you come to the saturation phase. Everything kind of hits the brakes and reverts to average. And the first thing to tip, and we see this regularly, the first thing to tip is the lack of alignment, the lack of consensus. As internally you begin to have those debates, you begin to doubt one another, and that can be problematic, especially when left unaddressed, because if you don't address it and you hit the commoditization phase, you really have a fever, if you will. The company is sick, and it's sick on the inside, not just on the outside. And one of the things that has to be done is not just addressing the external dynamics of new products, services, or becoming more competitive, but the internal dynamic of alignment and focus and consistency and so forth. And one other thing I want to point out about this, what you see on your screen now are the 4 slides that I just took you through, the 4 phases of the cycle. And check this out. These are the number 1 business challenges that I showed you a few minutes ago. What I want to point out about this is, if you look at the left 2, when you're most relevant to the market, you're most focused on the market, right? Technology, competition, change, growth. On the right, when you're least relevant to the market, you're least focused on the market. You are more focused on yourself, leadership, and retention, and leadership, and prices, and morale, and those sorts of things. So at a very high level, and this is a very high level, this isn't a proscriptive presentation, but at a very high level, the answer is if you're on the right side of the disruption cycle, is to refocus yourself on the market. And that takes some doing. And we'll leave that aside because we're going to come back to that later this year in June and in next year's seminar and talk about those very things specifically related to this industry. One other thing that I have alluded to that I really want to point out is that this is so important because the cycle is turning faster. In your grandparents' day, someone could spend an entire career in one industry, frankly, in one job. And it wasn't that the cycle wasn't turning, it's just that it was turning so slowly that you didn't notice it. And so that's what changed. Baby boomers famously were told you're going to have 2 careers. and that's reflective of the fact that the cycle started turning more quickly. Now we're saying to millennials and Generation Z, I guess it is, not even really to think in terms of jobs or careers, but you're sort of a free agent out there, and that's because the cycle keeps going quicker and quicker. This is a study I just found from Deloitte. They surveyed healthcare CEOs, and the quote was just so good I couldn't ignore it. In 2012, the pace of change was constant and linear. 7 years later, they see constant acceleration as a basic feature of the industry, and that's true in so many different industries. In the 1920s, the average company was on the S&P 500 list for 65 years. Today, the average company is on the S&P 500 for 10 years. A few months ago, the Wall Street Journal did a special section. It was their 150th anniversary or something, and so they just pulled a bunch of old newspaper stories that were kind of fun to read. So this is 1935 when color film was introduced, and people were like, I don't know, you're going to want to watch color movies? Or 1948, where you could hear a whole album of music on a single record. It's fun to read these because, it's history. It was all newfangled at the time. Or this one, November 10th, 1969, where they talked about the launch of Sesame Street, which is, kind of neat in terms of history. But a few of the articles really caught my eye. This series here was interesting. In 1956, GM profits topped $1 billion, hugest company in the world. 1958, 2 Japanese automakers come to the U.S., and it's kind of an aside. Nobody really noticed them. But then 1973, with the oil embargo, the world changed for Detroit, and we all know that story. It fundamentally changed because of an external event. Similarly, you got 1949 there with a giant computer that wasn't even as sophisticated as a calculator today. And then in 1977, the computer moves from the corporation to your living room. That's what we were talking about with Apple and PCs. 1981, Apple faces its critical period. We talked about that. And then you get into, the future of computing with Microsoft, who took over the world. In the late 1990s, we all thought Microsoft was the epitome of evil, and the Justice Department went after them and everything else. Today, nobody really says that, even though as of last week, Microsoft was the biggest company in the world, highest market cap. And the reason is because of the company on the right there, right? So we had Netscape and the internet thing, and then here comes Amazon, here comes Google, here comes Facebook, here comes all these companies. And if you're in the tech industry, this thing is just spinning faster than you care for it to spin. I love this. This is from Fortune magazine in March of '98, how Yahoo won the search wars. And later that year, Google was founded. We know what's happened to Yahoo. This was 22 years ago. It just wasn't that long. Even less long ago, 13 years ago, the iPhone was released in June of 2007. And later that year, Forbes said, Nokia, can anyone catch the cell phone king? That was 13 years ago. And we know what happened. So the cycle of change is just, technology is just changing things dramatically. This is a picture, I know you know the story, but it's a picture of what happened to the analog photo industry. Just dropped off overnight. If you ask people what the number one TV network is, I was stumping people for a while with that, but now people are correctly guessing Netflix, number one TV network. Some people say, well, Netflix isn't a TV network. I'm like, yeah, tell that to ABC, NBC, and CBS. We saw what happened to Blockbuster. They actually had a subscription service like Netflix, but they abandoned it. They also could have purchased Netflix, but they didn't see that as necessary. And so in a very short period of time, their revenue went from $6 billion to nothing overnight. And now Netflix can't celebrate, even though it's a very young company that's doing very well, because the mouse has come. And now Disney and their streaming service. And so even Netflix, they're losing subscribers, or their subscriber growth is slowing in the U.S. Internationally, they're still gaining subscribers. But talk about a young industry, how fast this thing is changing. Airbnb came along and disrupted business travel. We all know about that. Initially, Marriott and Hilton and the big hotel companies just blew off Airbnb, but then they woke up to it. And so now Marriott has put together its own short-term vacation rentals business, but powered by its its frequent stay program. So now Airbnb is on its heels. It's just incredible how fast all these things are changing. This is just my favorite example. This last one is recorded music revenues in the U.S., which in 2000, the turn of the century, were $20 billion. By 2015, they were down to $2 billion. This chart shows it coming back up. You can see in more recent years, but look at the yellow that I've highlighted here between that $20 billion peak all the way down to, or $15 peak all the way down to where it is today. What's in yellow? That revenue just disappeared. Blockbuster's revenue went to Netflix. It had a place to go. This revenue just disappeared. So there's never been a better time to be a consumer of music, but it's not such a great time to be a producer of music. And that's reflective of just the fact of creative destruction, that over a 28-year period here, a couple of economists said that the economy averaged 2% job growth a year, but at the same time, 15% of all jobs were destroyed every year. How does that work? Well, 17% are created and 15% are destroyed, and the net is 2, something like that. It just goes to show you the economy might look like a nice smooth ocean on the top, but underneath animals are eating each other. And you don't want to be part of that 15%, right? The 15% come from the right side of the disruption cycle. And it used to be that we in the white collar business would say those poor people in Dayton, Ohio, and Flint, Michigan, whose jobs are being replaced by robots, thank goodness mine isn't. Well, we can't be so fast to say that, because what's happening now is the mechanization of mind, or as this professor from the Harvard Business School says, everything that can be automated will be automated. And if you think about it, how much information processing this industry does, pretty much anything that is information processing can be automated, and it will be. So one of the tasks for an industry like ours that has to look at how do we redisrupt ourselves is to consider what is fundamentally human that can't be automated versus what can be automated. And it's kind of a daunting thought, but that's why we take it a step at a time. I don't know the answers. You don't know the answers. There's certain people who are experimenting, but it's a bit of a daunting task. And so the first question is, well, let's go back to Richard Rummelt. What are the forces at work? Can we have a coherent viewpoint about the forces at work? Where do we think we are in this broad and bold proposition? And that's why we are introducing the Insurance Industry Disruption Index, where AIIAT is taking the bold step of offering this study up to its members, where we're going to collect 53 questions worth of information from each member. Study's being fielded now through February 20th. It literally takes 5 minutes to fill out. We ask that you be honest about it, but it takes 5 minutes to fill out. And at the June workshop, we're going to actually present the overall industry report, as well as individual company reports. There's an option to get individual staff reports as well. One of the things I want to assure you, if you take this study, it is completely confidential. Your company report will be seen only by your company. IIAT is going to roll all the data up into the overall industry cohort, but you'll be able to compare your organization against the industry in general with respect to where you are in the cycle and what issues you might be dealing with. And having done this now in a handful of other industries, you'll find that it's incredibly enlightening, because you'll see where you may be ahead of your peers, where you may be behind your peers, and where the industry is overall. And that will just unleash the creativity. And so we're asking everybody to go to iiatsurvey.org. I'll come back to this in a moment, so you don't have to write it down. But just to wrap up, the reasons why we're doing this is because if you go to what Sir George said, he actually didn't stop there. He said that there is actually a prescription for doing this. Every business has a dying core because that's the old heart of the business. That's what we've been talking about in terms of the disruption cycle. The only way you're going to be able to grow the business is by making sure you have the balance right between two things. One, how you manage the decline or the stability of the core. That is your bread and butter business. Have to manage that right, have to take care of it, have to focus on it. But two, what you do in new areas. And that's what an awareness of the disruption cycle provides you, is the understanding of the need for and the urgency related to making sure that you're continually disrupting yourselves. Because Schumpeter said it well, that we live in an economy of creative destruction, which is fabulous for us as consumers because it makes products cheaper and more available, and it does wonderful things for us. Not so good for us if we're part of the 15% of jobs that are destroyed every year. And so our philosophy is, instead of looking at it as creative destruction, we simply change a word and think of it in terms of creative disruption. And the reason is, with destruction, you're a victim. But in disruption, you can be an agent. You can be an agent of change, an agent of disruption, leading to the creation of something new. And that's why I come back to this statement to wrap it up. Your business doesn't have a brand. Your brand has a business. You should hold loosely to your business model. Hold tightly to your business proposition, because your proposition will probably never change. Your model must, and it must change more quickly than we often give it credit for. A lot more to come on that as we go through the year. Today's presentation was about introducing you to the disruption cycle, the need for it, and why we do it. And I will leave this last slide up on the screen. If we have any questions, we can talk about them. I'd really encourage you between now, and the next couple of days. It will really only take 5 minutes. So go to IIATsurvey.org, and it should be very self-explanatory. If not, there's a help button you can click. So I want to thank you for your time. Really appreciate you listening. Hopefully you'll be participating, and I will open it or turn it back over to Matt now to see if we have any questions.